wits about me when with him in the political arena, although often privately sympathising with our budgetary problems and grant cuts and other absurdities from central government, his technique in the public arena was to lull you into a false sense of security before going for the jugular. So Ken's wiliness and his tactical nous in leading the opposition against the Labour Council certainly could never ever be underestimated. So under that rural charm of Farmer Ken, there's a canny political operator who'll be sorely missed by his own group, I'm pleased to say, and by the rest of us for different reasons, basically because he's a nice guy and doesn't take it all too seriously. John Collins, who was leader of my group, reminded me of a time when he and Ken went off to a conference. I don't know who was leader of the council at that time, but they went off to this conference and somehow ended up in an amusement park on the Dodgems. Now that might have been a newfangled leadership exercise, I'm not sure, but I think they had, it shows Ken's sense of fun really, doesn't it? And earlier this year, before Ken retired, I could tell he was demob happy when I walked into the council chamber to find him sitting in the second row, rather than in his opposition leader's seat on the front row. So ladies and gentlemen, if you're not on the council, you're perhaps not aware of that significance. You know, as leader of the opposition, you always sit in the seat that Eric is sitting at the moment. What's going on here? So I asked him, what's going on, Ken? Have you been deposed at last? Have they got impatient about you not deciding whether to retire or not? No, he told us all with a mischievous grin, and pointing to his front row of senior Tory councillors, he explained, well, they were all arguing about who should sit in the front row. I told them they could all sit on the front row, and so there's no room for me. However, he did take that seat back at the next meeting. I've known Ken for a long time. He'd already been on the council for 4 years when I first came on the council in 1982. Back then, when Joe Hood was Conservative leader, hardly a meeting went by when Ken didn't mention the rural areas, with the accusation that the Labour Council ignored them and was just not interested in the issues and problems of the rural areas. There was a time, more than once in fact, when we were accused of favouritism by funding events in the town and not the Longridge show. And I think it eventually did get some financial support. Really, the people in the rural areas just could not have had a greater advocate. One of my colleagues, I mean, I've had ever such a lot of anecdotes, and it's been difficult to choose, but one of my colleagues this morning just reminded me of a time in December 1988 when we had Edwina Curry saying eggs were all infected with salmonella poisoning. Ken, being a chicken farmer and seeing his business threatened, gave every single councillor a free egg in a specially prepared box. So that shows his commitment, really, doesn't it? Some of you may be surprised to learn that Ken wasn't a Tory to start with. Some of my colleagues are probably amazed at that. He was originally elected as an independent councillor, and at the time there were rumours about his political leanings. Ken was always great friends with the Alcorns. Some of you here will probably remember the Alcorns in Goosna. Carol was a Labour councillor in the 80s, and Harry, now sadly dead, was at the heart of the Labour Party's election machine. Harry told me, and this was many years ago, but it did stick in my head, that in fact Ken had considered joining the Labour Party. Now, whether that was a gentle tease by Ken, I suspect it was actually, but it certainly would have been the kiss of death in rural North. he certainly wouldn't have lasted 36 years. The freedom of the city of Preston carries no privilege. So sorry, Ken, you can't drive your sheep or even your hens through Fishergate. The description of our freedom ship states, it is purely an honour, recognition of significant and valuable services rendered to the borough by that person. I would say with confidence that that description fits Ken like a glove. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is one decision of this council that absolutely no one could say is controversial. It's a wholehearted and unanimous decision, and Ken, we wish you and Susan well as you sail off into the sunset in your narrow boat. So I now need to formally, it gives me great pleasure, Mr. Mayor, to formally second the resolution that Ken Hudson be conferred the Honorary Freeman of the City of Preston. Thank you.
I now invite Councillor Mrs. Pauline Brown to speak in support of the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Ken Hudson, distinguished guests, Honorary Freeman, Honorary Aldermen, fellow councillors, Reverend Sirs, ladies and gentlemen. What wonderful accolades my two colleagues have paid to Ken, well deserved for a man who has dedicated his life to public service whilst building a successful business for himself and his family. When I first met Ken, I thought he was a typical bluff farming type, but I soon realised that behind this persona was a man with a sharp, incisive mind and a strong desire to see that the rural areas were protected and cared for in the right way. And he wasn't always a farmer. He was working as a flock controller for chickens when he first met his wife Susan, and she was working for a telephone manager. Susan is the type of woman who personifies the adage, behind every great man is a great woman. She has been his mainstay throughout his public career and his personal life. She's a wife, a mother, and even first mate on the canals on their boat, Marie Celeste. In fact, Ken and Susan celebrate 50 years of marriage this year, which is an achievement in itself. I'm not saying it's an achievement being with you all the time. I don't know if they're going to celebrate it at Winmarley Village Hall, though, where they had their wedding reception, but perhaps not, because Susan's parents were staunch Methodists and wouldn't allow a bar at the wedding. So I would imagine that this time the champagne will be flowing. When Ken became a magistrate, and I'm going to say this in Ken speak, the local villains knew that they were, when Ken summed up, well, they were in for a long sentence. Ken, you have been a joy to work with, and have made many a meeting better with your own inimitable ways and your sense of humour, your very dry sense of humour. You will be missed for your down-to-earth wisdom, and I, for one, think that this council has lost one of its favourite characters. Enjoy your retirement, Ken, and enjoy your freemanship of the city of Preston. And as has been previously said, I don't think they'll let you drive your chickens through Preston. You might have to borrow a few sheep to take advantage of that privilege. Enjoy your retirement with your wife and your lovely family, Ken. And all best wishes. Thank you.
I will now invite Councillor Tom Davies to speak on behalf of the veterans.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen. As Chairman of the Preston District Veterans Council, I'd like to thank Ken, as do all the veterans, for when he was in office as leader of the council. He played a very big part, a main part, in getting the Roll of Honour placed into the library. And if it weren't for Ken, I don't think we'd have had it yet. But I'd like to thank you, Ken, for helping us with that. It's for members of the armed forces who die in service, and it's for anybody in Preston to go and have a look. And like I said, thank you very much, Ken, for your assistance.